Yeah. Okay. So, how do we all go with the stuff from last week? What kind of practice did we do?
Well,
we got paper now. Whoa.
Yeah, I know. Like some people are super organized, printing things out.
Yeah, that's what I've tried to do. I'm trying to get on top of it.
Is that fretless?
Yeah,
Nice.
I picked it up. It's so fun. I love it. I haven't played it in like 2 weeks, so I picked it up today. And I'm like, wow.
Yeah, I had a friend who'd bring his fretless to some gigs, especially if things got a little bit folkier. He'd always bring his fretless. They have a cool sound, and it's like, if you think about it like a double bass, you think it's going to add a bunch of bass, and it doesn't. It kind of adds a weird fuzzy mid-range.
Yeah, definitely.
But in that way, because it's like a fuzzy mid-range, it kind of stands out more.
Oh,
Like
100%. That's the reason why I initially, what kind of introduced me to the fretless stuff was in like technical death metal, because of obviously you got the distorted guitars and the heavy drums. So it's just this emptiness in like the mid-range. So like most bands just started ending up using fretless just eventually, and it just sort of fit in the mix a lot easier.
Wow.
Here's a but with fretless. You haven't had to do any editing, Chris, with holy fuck, bro. That shit editing in the studio, like when you slide slightly, like you miss the note slightly, when we would do, Dave and I would do your bass editing, you have to make sure everything's like just.
Oh, yeah, in tune, yeah. I'm not the best, but yeah.
When we were doing like what song? Oh, yeah, Memoirs. When we were doing the editing for that, there was like times you'd like be like just slightly out, and it would sound like, and we'd have to like fix it. It's such a tedious process with doing it with a.
And then trying to make that sound not edited is really hard.
Yeah.
Because like autotune's great for slamming a note straight to like, here's the pitch, but it leaves a lot of telltale like sounds. And especially if you've slid into a note, you've got to choose like which bit of the waveform you then translate to being. And like sometimes you can handle that by like crossfading between two different samples. So like you double up your track, you tune one of them, and you crossfade halfway through. And yeah, it can be a lot of fun. I mean, the simplest answer, of course, is get better at pitching. Like practice the pitching thing, and the more of it you play, the better it'll get. However, like. It's also important to recognize that most double bass players, especially in the jazz world, are pretty terrible at pitching.
With the good ones can pitch though.
Oh yeah. Like as always, the best ones can pitch. However, bass registers are difficult to hear the tuning in, especially if you've got a bunch of distorted guitars who are also shitting on your frequencies. Like, guitar drops surprisingly low. Like guitar is almost a bass instrument anyway. Like this whole thing of us reading the treble state is nonsense. Like that's because we've transposed everything up an octave, so it all sits in the stabilizer. Hey, Damien. I'll add you as here. Otherwise, I'm so bad at taking attendance. Yeah. Well, no. I mean, look. I think fretless is cool, and sometimes that little bit out of tune, right? Like that's kind of
characteristics.
Its charm, yeah. I like in metal, I could see it being a huge problem, especially if everyone's dropping. Like if everyone's drop tuned, everyone's notes are so close, you'd have to be really on the ball about it. Yeah. Okay. Well, other than that, how did everyone go with the work generally?
Wait, what was that again? Which one was that?
You have to ask, probably not that well.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So things that you need to have brushed up on: triads, pentatonics, really, because we're talking about adding the 6 and the 9 to the triad. So did anyone actually do anything with it?
I mean, I'm pretty good with like the pentatonic shapes, like the the pentatonic shapes.
Yeah, that's a good first step. Triads are something you guys need to hit much heavier.
The triads and inversions.
Yeah, I mean, like, inversions and triads, same thing. They're things that you need to hit really, really quite heavy, because they're just unbelievably useful for bass players. They're unbelievably useful for all musicians, but especially bass players. Which I suppose leads me into the sheet that got sent out, the one that's the arpeggios. So I'm just going to kill the guitar ones. Where's the bass ones? There we go, bass. So did anyone take a look at this before the lesson, like the ones that I sent out last night?
Numbers, is it? And the tonic, supertonic. Like,
No. That's the other sheet. We'll get to that in a second.
Is it the
I'm
one
talking...
with the like major augmented sus2?
Yeah. Man, why is this so hard to just download a copy from the email I sent?
I think one of them was a PDF and the other one was I think Word doc.
Yeah. So it's the PDF. Here we go. All right. So what you got is climbing using the triad shapes that we've been talking about, turning them into a set of arpeggios that climb the neck, which should do a couple things. One, show you how to connect some of these ideas together. Two, get you to practice arpeggios all over the neck, which is a pretty important thing. I actually find it more useful to focus in on this kind of thing than, say, trying to do 3-octave arpeggios. So like a 3-octave arpeggio. Right. You cover a great deal of space doing that, but it's not used that often. In the Romantic period, used a lot. Like there's a whole bunch of classical guitar pieces that'll get you to do that exact thing, but not crazy useful, I think, for a lot of other styles. So what this is doing them in 4-note sequences. Now, I really suggest you finger them in 4-note chunks. For example, this first set. But when we come to the 4 on the G string, I would switch to your first finger. Right, and what I'm doing is going 1, 2, 1, 3, or 4. Preferably 3. So that way you can come up to 10, 10. So going through all of these, and especially these primary triads, major, augmented, sus, diminished, minor, these are the things that you guys are going to use a lot, all right? Extensions are, dangerous is the wrong word. Extensions must be carefully used on a bass. Things that can sound really good even in a guitar register tend not to sound good in a bass register. If you want to use lots of crazy and interesting extensions and chords, you are better off doing it above the 12th fret. You know, because when you're up here, that's my register kind of down here. Now, there's a lot of beautiful things that can be done with bass melody up in that register, and really, you should explore them a fair bit. Like when we start talking more about improvising melody, which we might do in the next couple of weeks, that's where you guys should be doing most of your work, is up here, right? Down here, playing melodies is a bit tricky. For one thing, the human hearing is not very good down in this range. It can also be why people have this kind of negative attitude towards bass solos. Like, how do you guys feel about bass solos as bass players?
Context. It all depends on the context and the accompaniment of it, like when it's used.
Any other thoughts?
And it sounds better on a fretless.
What about you, Ethan? What do you think bass solos?
Not too sure. Like, I know, like, I think they're not very common, and probably for a reason almost. Like, they're alright, but they should be very short. Like that you can do some cool stuff, but like in the context of most, like, I guess, popular or any like styles of music, a lot of the time, like people in like compared to a guitar solo, there's, I feel like it's not limited, but like doing like arpeggios and like shit like scale work sounds a bit more obvious on a bass than a guitar. Like, unless like people are going to be creative and use like pedals or some shit to create like some sort of effect, I think like it comes like pretty stale quickly. Like,
Yeah. I mean, by and large, I think all of those things are true. I don't think there is actually a great deal. You wouldn't have to apply genre guidelines to a bass solo. What you have to do is think about your part and think about how to convey stuff. Now, great. You guys watch Adam Neely? If you don't watch Adam Neely, you should watch it. Bass. I think that every time I write bass in capital letters. Yeah, so he was doing an interesting thing about this. I think one of his Instagram Q&As recently. And he points out this interesting thing that when you're up in this register, there's a real
melancholy, didn't he say? Yeah, delicacy.
Yeah. To the sound, right? And that's the kind of thing that you probably need to think about, is that if you want a tough and driving solo, then basses are probably not the best instrument to choose for that. However, I mean, look, with the way that guitars are drop tuning in metal these days, half of the guitar solos are effectively bass solos. You know, like, there's a lot of stuff that is going on in modern metal with all this drop tuning that I am thinking it sounds completely indistinct. You know, like, you're doing a bunch of your pick squeals and things and really fast rips on the bottom three strings. And it's like, when you have tuned to a bass, it becomes this wall of fairly indistinct sounds because human hearing is not great in that range. But for all of your own playing, you should play a lot of melodies, right? Melodies will teach you things that that playing bass lines will not. And good bass players are also surprisingly good at playing melodies. You know, there's been quite a few interesting little moments in the Adam Neely's channel. There's one where he's doing learning to appreciate contemporary Christian music. And in that, he starts playing kind of solo bass arrangements of some of these, you know, worship songs. Now, he's not a fan of the genre or the zeitgeist, but he's doing an interesting challenge, which you should all do. If you don't like something musically, you better be able to define it in 3,000 words or more. Is utter laziness and nonsense that musicians need to ditch to be able to just go, I don't like it. That's not good enough. You know, you need to articulate why you don't like it. And during that process of learning how to articulate that, you'll probably also find a whole bunch of things that this genre that you don't like does well. And I think a challenge for good musicians is to learn how to appreciate things they don't like. You know, I don't really like what I would refer to as shit-kicking country. However, pretty much the same kind of chords as classic rock. Vocal harmony is pretty amazing inside of all country styles. They have some really interesting things that they do with voices. The guitar chops, like, you know, people like Alan Lee, man, that guy can move, right? Like, I don't like the genre, but I could articulate why I don't like it, and I can also articulate why someone else would like it. So that's an aside to the whole melodic comment, which is you should check out a few different melodies. You should start teaching yourself melodies. You know, I think, was it last semester, somebody was working on one of the cello suites on the bass. That's a great idea. Of course, the cello suites are from the Baroque era. And while you must play that with a certain kind of melodic inflection, doesn't technically have a melody. So another thing that would be good for you guys to figure out is when we take a look at a jazz standard, learn the melody, play it up here, and try to make it sound as much as possible like someone who's singing it. It's a very different set of rules and experiences to playing bass lines, which tend to be a little bit more on the beat, a little bit more predictable. And what doing that, playing melodies, is going to give you is a melodic sense. It's going to give you a better sense of inflection and articulation, and of how to use some stranger sounds when you want to. So what I'd like you all to do is to go through, not right now, because we're going to move on to the other sheet, but to go through these arpeggios and start bringing them into your daily practice. I wouldn't worry about speed necessarily, just worry about clean fingerings. And that should help you start thinking more about where your triads are on each point in the neck, right? Which is going to be hugely important for some other things. So let's switch over to the other sheet. This is kind of like the theory component, which will be very, very, very applicable to you as you guys start composing more and more. And bass players tend to make pretty good composers, I've found. So bone up on your theory and stuff. So we're going to start with a quick description of the difference between what's called the national numbering system, which is what you guys have been doing with Roman numerals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for chords, and what I call the old money words. So the old money names were things like tonic, supertonic, mediant, subdominant, dominant, submediant, leading note, tonic octave. We're not really going to dive into too much of the meanings behind those things. They actually do describe a lot of the functions of the chords, how you use those chords, as well as their position. So there are some real bonuses to that old naming system. But the thing to focus on right now is that the 5 chord is what we call the dominant chord. This is where we get this idea of dominant sevenths. Scrolling down a little further, 2 paragraphs down, there's this little kind of quote thing in the middle saying, in the key of G, a G chord with a 7th would have the notes G, B, D, and F sharp. In the key of C, where the G chord is the dominant chord, we would have the notes G, B, D, and F. This is where we get the idea of a flat 7 chord. Whenever we use a chord in the dominant position, if we extend that triad just like we always do, 1 further leap of a third past the 5th, we get a different 7 than when we do it in the major scale. All right? We're going to call, or what we decided to settle on, was calling the one that is the dominant chord 7, the dominant 7. It's a flat 7. It's the one that's a fret lower than you would normally expect to find the 7 from a major scale. Next up on the sheet, we've got a little thing which is about what I like to call the musical justice system, where everything is presumed major and dominant in the same way that everyone is presumed innocent or proven guilty. Right? Your friend says, play C, and they mean C major. They don't bother saying the major part. It's already presumed. They say play C7, and what they mean is play a C major chord with a dominant 7th attachment. Now, why that's important, right, is that if it says major in the title, it's really, really unlikely they're talking about the chord. They're talking almost certainly about the extension. Because a major 7th could be found in any type of chord, right? One of the examples under that next paragraph is C minor major 7. It's a C minor chord that has a major 7th, right? C minor, 7th, a semitone down from the root. It's the James Bond. So a really cool and important extension, but it has nothing to do with the original chord it goes under. You could have C augmented major 7, which would sound super weird. Here's a different octave. Strange chord sound, but it's totally allowable. All right, so last week we covered 6s and 9s. a quick refresher on that is the idea that you have your triads. And we find where the 6 and the 9 would be around each triad. So there's the 9, there's the 6. And you get used to doing that in a whole bunch of different positions because they're the ones you're going to rely on the most. From there, for major, for spicy sounds, we could try a major 7th. Now, major 7th, I imagine on the bass, you guys will sound pretty dissonant when you play this. Anyone plugged in? Can I try that? So play a C root and then a B above it. Yeah. Pretty dissonant. It's actually kind of a cool sound. You could use that if you wanted to ratchet up a whole bunch of tension on a 1 chord. But it's likely you might have to find some other places to find to kind of use those. So, or you might use them as a passing tone. Right? Somewhere that you move and touch so that way it is introduced into the sound, but not necessarily one that you play at the same time as another note, or one that you move from that to the resolution, to C. All right, so the example in the music here is just talking about where to find them, which is essentially, could be a minor second above, sorry, a minor second below the root or a major third above the 5th. Next up for major chords would be to use the augmented 4th. On a subdominant chord, you can always use a sharp 4. Makes this kind of sound. Lydian kind of sound. From there, we move into dominant chords. Dominant chords, the whole point of a dominant chord. What's the point of a dominant chord?
Resolve back to 1.
Right. These are pointing chords. They're supposed to kind of push us down to the 1. Because of this, the tritone in it, the third of the G chord in this instance is going to move up to the root of the C. And the 4th is going to fall to the 3rd. And the idea is if it points because we have chromatic change between the two of them, we could heighten that and get more chromatic change between the two of them. So if we put in a sharp 5 as well, it makes that resolve even stronger. Here it is for sharp 9, sorry, flat 9. So then we go through a little bit on how to find them. Sharp 5 is found a minor second above the 5th. Flat 9 is found a minor second above the root. Now, onto the real work, right? That's a real crash course. You should read those things. You should think about those things. It is theory you need to get used to. But the real work in this lesson is taking a look at this chord progression, the nearness of you. It's been slightly simplified. There's usually a couple extra chords that get thrown in different versions. First off, can anyone read the chart? Can anyone play a bass line over that set of chords?
Wait, is this for the nearness of you?
Yeah.
Yeah, read the chart. Like, so play like the bass over the chart.
Yeah. Let me
Oh, like right now?
Yeah, do.
Like what tempo? Just kind of like.
Like count it yourself. Like, be kind to yourself. Don't make like you got 2 big changes coming up, so like don't count it at 140.
Oh, yeah, true. So. It's fucking weird to play this without any chords or I play some accompaniment. I'll just put up. That's fucking odd to do without any drums or a chord, but yeah.
Yeah, you should do a fair bit of this kind of stuff.
Having to do it at school, but
yeah, look, this is some stuff you should do a fair amount of. Just being able to make a bunch of chords sound a bit like a song. Not that you're doing badly with it at all. So first step would be, can you play it? All right. Can you play it multiply different ways? So one of the most fun and interesting things on the bass is the way you tie these things together becomes really important. Where you start on the neck, and also not necessarily always targeting your root notes. So one thing before we even talk about extensions that I would suggest is putting constraints on yourself. Like Ethan, is it a fair thing to say that you were recycling a bunch of things that you would normally play? So like if you saw an E chord there, you have a kind of an E chord riff thing you'd use.
It was kind of like the first thing that popped in my head was like, so like until I figure out like a main sort of way, a root, like just kind of stick to that like sort of like shape that you usually put to an E chord.
Yeah.
Until I could figure out.
And I'm assuming it probably has a pretty similar rhythm pattern and a pretty similar note choice to other E chords you see. Like
Yeah,
yeah.
I guess, yeah.
Okay.
Like, I'm thinking back because most of the time that I had to play like chart music, like the last time like on the spot was like really like school. So in my head it's like shitty fucking church music that's like 6/4/5. So it's kind of like that's what like my head almost goes to for playing like whenever I get given a chart that I've like never like seen before or heard.
Yeah. Look, all of those licks and things that we rely on are actually good things. They save our ass quite often. Like you're at an open mic night and that you got to support a bunch of like singers who can't sing, and you need someone that just ties it into the chords, right? Like we've got to be loud and clear. For development purposes, though, I think applying constraints is a great idea. So
Yeah.
what you could do, for instance, is limit yourself to 2 strings. Not allowed to do any other note across anything else. So if we start with like E to B minor, E7, right? You don't have that string. And what you'll find is that by exploring things that way, you'll come up with a bunch of much more interesting lines. For one thing, you won't be allowed to always go to the root note of a chord because the root note won't be always available. So you've got to find ways of making things work in a direction. Now, that's another good constraint too, is giving yourself a directional constraint. Like, I'm going to start here, but I have to climb the neck with my bass line. Right? It's a fun and interesting game to play with yourself. Why, though, is a really important thing to realize. Just like a guitar solo, if you start low and build the whole progression as you go up, you will ratchet tension up. And a great place for a bass player to do that is in line with the guitar solo. Now, I'm a Led Zeppelin fan. Like, I don't want to hide any of my biases here, but one of the great things about Led Zeppelin as a band was that as they improvised, they all listened and responded to one another. There's so many times where you hear what is quite clearly an improvised line live from Jimmy Page that inspires a fill underneath it from John Bonham. Jimmy Page does something in 6s and you hear John Bonham just come in with 6s underneath it, right? Or Jimmy Page is doing something kind of like frantic, so John starts doing like weird jazz patterns on the ride because it kind of sits in and complements what's going on. He comps, right? Comping is this jazz player idea that I think more people should focus on in every style you do. You want to color the other part that's going on. All right. So if the guitarist is leaning way back, maybe what you want to do is lean way back. Maybe what you want to do is play everything in a really low register, especially if the guitarist is playing a lot of things in a low register. You either need to do it lower than him or higher than him. But it gives you a lot of control, which is why you've got to play with these ideas, right? And something that is a nice set of chords like this that ask a little bit of you, right? There's a few chords in here that are kind of breaking key signature or breaking key signature for a reason. And it's actually a fairly melodic progression. It would be good for you guys to get familiar with the song, right? It's a jazz standard. You should get familiar with some jazz standards. It's kind of a, like, you get to be a certain level as a player, and if you don't know some jazz standards, then I don't think you're a certain level as a player. In the same way that you should get familiar with, say, the cello suites by Bach and, you know, a bunch of other cultural repertoire, cultural canon, let's call it, musical canon you've got to kind of get used to. So, first step would be, how many different ways can you think of playing this? You know, practice it for a good 20 minutes where maybe you only ever do one direction or one path twice. You know, once to find out what it is, second time to reinforce it, then you ditch it, and then you do some other constraint. It's all got to go down. It's all got to go up. It can't leave here, right? Like, any constraints you could place on yourself are great. And then you want to start thinking about some extensions, especially when we do the constraints with, say, like only allowed to use two strings. So if we take all chords from here on out just for a little while and do the jazz player thing, where chords get defined as major chords, minor chords, and dominant chords, and there ain't no other chords. I don't know if you ever listen to really good jazz players talk, but they quite often do this really annoying thing where they play some amazing chord and they go, yeah, it's A minor. You know, or they play a diminished or minor 7 flat sign. Like, yeah, it's D minor. It's a D minor chord. It's like, no, it's a D minor 7 flat 5. But it's part of how they simplify their thinking, is that they don't necessarily think of, say, diminished chords and minor 7 flat 5 chords as being a different family. It's just part of the minor family, right? It gives them access to manipulating things in particular ways. So we're going to break everything up. Major chords, minor chords, and dominant chords. There's a chart on the next page, which is just a list of where you'd find all of these different extensions from triads. And that's where you should start. So, like, for example, I've got a little, you know, something like this option. The first chord is E. That's a major chord, right? It's not a dominant chord. It's a major chord. So we could do E major 7. We could do E major 9. We could do potentially E augmented 4th, although that usually works better on the subdominant chord on the 4th chord. And then you could think about that as options to play. So if we were doing our constraints practice, right, just the D and G strings. Here's E major. Then we might do, say, E major 7. All right. Now that creates something interesting in the line. This note really stands out. The next chord is B minor, and a really important color tone for B minor is its third, which is a semitone back from that major 7th. Well, that's going to sound really cool if we hit it. Right? So on that E, I use the flat 9 extension. Right? The E root note is here. Flat 9 is a semitone above that. Creates a hell of a lot of tension. But that's appropriate because we're playing a dominant chord. Dominant chord's whole point is to create tension, so we can amp that tension up. Another flat 9 on the C sharp 7. Starting on the 3rd this time. So getting familiar with this idea of, say, thinking about your chords by function, thinking about these chords by how much they ratchet tension, is going to be a really, really kind of beneficial thing for you. So what I'd like you to do is start out. I would like you to come up with a line. Just take the next 5 minutes to come up with a line just in plain triads that only use the D and G string. Because I'm assuming they're probably the strings that you're less familiar with. If you're crazy familiar with your D and G strings because you're some kind of freak bass player, then do it on the strings you're less familiar with. Maybe A and D is less familiar to you, but I seriously doubt that. I'm pretty sure everyone's pretty good with their E and A strings. All right, so take 5 minutes, come up with a bass line. You do not have to start in the position that I'm starting in. Start anywhere you like on the neck. A great option would be to start somewhere you're not very confident with. And only worry about notes from the D and G string. Then as soon as someone's got something, let me know. All right, anyone got a line yet?
Yep.
All right, let me hear it.
I think I'm up the F sharp. Oh yeah, that's right. That's where.
Can you turn your bass up anyway?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That better?
Nice. Now it's firing out. Hey, on your in your little audio settings, have you got enable original audio on?
What do you mean?
So if you go down to the bottom right hand corner, this is a trick you should all do for Zoom meetings. When you click on more or your audio settings button, if you scroll down through it, there'll be one called enable original sound. That takes a lot of the like background noise cancellation and stuff off.
Let me look. Zoom preferences, audio. Join advanced. Oh yeah. Persistence and echo cancellation. Suppress. Disable. Suppress intermittent background noise.
Yep, that's a good one. So knock off.
Is this sound better now?
Whoa, yeah, it's so much louder. You can probably turn it down a touch.
Okay. I just forgot where I was at.
Okay, so I would say you could keep your idea simpler, right? you don't have to move.
Ideas.
Yeah, you don't have to move a great deal to make a powerful line. And what you're still trying to capture very much, and I know it's very much being put on the spot because you had like 5 minutes to come up with this, right? But what you're trying to capture still is the color of the chord, the flavor of the chord. So like if I was going to do, I think you were starting right here. Right, I'm just picking more of the root notes. It was more successful in the first half of the line than the second half of the line. But by keeping it simpler, it's easier to identify which chords are going past. Right? So try, what I would suggest you're looking for is things that sound like the chords. So then we get B minor, B7 to an A, A minor, E, C, F, sorry, yeah. Then we do a 3-6-2-5 turnaround. Right, so just doing really quite a clear sounds. Yeah, and I'd say start out that way. Start out trying to do things really highlighting the basic colors of chords. There are lots of different interesting ways that all of these things interact with each other. Like if we start here on E, E major. Well, the next chord is B minor, so we have an option we could come up. Right, or we could come down. Right, and those choices you make are what determines the overall sound of your line. So start simple, then the next time you go through it, choose a different direction to go in. If you went up to, all right, then the next time you play it, go down. Because you're going to come up with very different lines when you start constructing them. All right, anyone got another example?
I give it a go, I guess.
Yeah, it's here, man. Is your camera on?
Is it?
There you go. Yeah, cool. It was
Yeah,
just taking
fine.
ages to switch over.
My internet's kind of bad, but. I did F sharp, not C sharp. But yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, that was strong in the sense that you're using a lot of repeated phrases. What we didn't get at all was the color of the E7. Yeah. So for both of your E licks, you're doing like a. Right. One problem with that is that we have already announced the flat 7 on the major chord. Right. right? Here's the flat 7 here, a minor third above the 1. So if we do that, that means it feels like we're doing this. Right? And that's not what we're doing. Like the first E is in the key of E, really particularly not a dominant chord, right? It's a major 7th chord. So one thing that would have been cool is your internet like totally dropped out? It seems to be. Okay, so one thing that would have been cool, right, is if you had to use the major 7 on the 1 chord. You can hear how that then suddenly speaks a lot of different color. And all I changed one, like, I mean, obviously I wasn't totally copying your line, but I changed one note from your idea. Instead of always using the flat 7, on the major chord, I used the major 7th. All right, then we go to minor. Then the E7. Then we're up to A. Right, so I'm using that major 7th again, shuffling backwards and forwards. Oh, then A minor. The 3rd from the E. Right? So this is why you've got to kind of think a little bit about what chord I'm on, what extension I'm going to use. Because those subtle changes, that one note, I think really changes the personality of that line. And it suddenly makes it much more interesting in a way that just the repetition alone is not going to do it. You know? We're going to talk more on one other point about that example in the coming weeks, which is you always want to think about developing melodic ideas. Right? One of the things about, you know, hopefully what we'll discuss and what you should discuss in some other courses is what you do to make a melody sound like a melody, right? And there are surprisingly like common little rules. Like if you set something up as your melodic idea on the first chord, you got to use it again somewhere. It doesn't have to be the same notes, but you have to borrow some kind of idea from it, right? So if I'm on this E major chord, all right, you can hear that like I am using a very similar melodic shape, right? They're all going these big whoa, 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 and it's what unifies that line to sound like it was intentional, sound like it was melodic and chosen intentionally. Because the whole way across, I was mirroring this pattern that I was using. What really starts to suck is when we do musical non sequiturs, which is, I'm not saying that's what you were doing. I actually think what you were probably doing is over-relying on pattern a bit, right? One thing about patterns is you do them twice, you do them 3 times, 4th time you put a variation in. And that's what makes the music interesting. Which the more you start studying melodies, and jazz standards are great way of doing the melodies usually really simple. You can just look at the shape of them. We talked about this last week with the other song we were doing. Can't remember what it was. Where the melody had this real, I'm building up to this note and then I fall by intervals. And then I build up with a kind of scale-wise motion and then I fall. So one thing you want to start thinking about doing is including a bit of variation. So like... So you hear the first 3 chord changes, they had something similar. They were doing their little So I came up with a new concept for the next 2 chords. Less of this kind of rocking backwards and forwards and less of this kind of sweeping movements and more like a staccato thing. Ba-da, da-da, ba-da, da, da-dum. Right? So a non sequitur, for instance, would be something like this. was shared between any of those lines. Right? Yeah, I mean, like I still hit all the chord tones. Technically speaking, that was still kind of right in a way, but none of the notes really told me to go anywhere. You know, or if they did, I didn't listen. Coming back to one of the first examples I talked about was if we do this. Oh, sorry. That's my idea for the E major 7, right? Well, if I'm playing this note, the major 7th right here, that's a really important sound that's about to change. The reason B minor seems interesting is because it breaks the key signature and puts in this note, 1 fret lower. The third of the B minor is a chromatic movement from there. So if I play this, and I don't play in the next bar or even the next note, it sounds like I'm doing this. You know, everyone in the room is screaming in their heads, I know this next note, and then you subvert that. And you don't do it in a way that is, well, I'm sorry, by you I mean one. Obviously, I'm not attacking anyone at the moment. But that's an important thing to pay attention to. While you're listening to yourself play, right, those first 4 chords set up a really interesting and beautiful chromatic line. E major 7, then the third from B minor and the flat 7 from E7 to the root from A, then the third from A major, and then the third from A minor. It's a totally chromatic line. And those notes are really, really easy to latch onto with your ear and very obvious. So you've got to play them. If you announce them, you have to play them. It's a bit like if you play the 4 on a chord. If you don't follow that with the third, 9 times out of 10, it's going to sound like you didn't know what you were doing. So you have to stay present and listening to yourself to figure out where the next suggested note in the melody is. I often think improvising and coming up with stuff like this is mostly listening and being open to the things that you create. You know, the worst thing you can get, especially when you start doing all of this kind of study that we're doing, where you're learning triads, you're learning these scales, is to mechanically just go to the next thing. So you want to think about, if I played this sound, what's the next note? Hum it to yourself. To me, it's da ba da ba da da. Right? These notes kind of suggest what the next thing is going to be, and you want to practice thinking about that. Thinking about, like, hum the line back to yourself and then hum the answer to it. Everybody who is in this course right now has played enough music to have an instinctive sense of that thing, of does it sound like music? The problem is that you probably don't use it enough. And the more you practice just doing this thing, open up a chord chart and you go, okay, I'm going to play this line. Okay, what did that line suggest my next line should be? Then the better and better and better at it you'll get. You know, like, and it's very different everyone on the neck. So if you start down here, right? Immediately, as soon as I did that E arpeggio, I want the B minor, and I played this note, which is kind of introducing the third from B minor, right? It will be boring if I just sit on the B, right? That sounded much cooler. And it didn't use the root note on the downbeat, it used the third. And I know that, like, I've said things about the third and the bass before, right? Like, the third can be a dangerous note, it can make chords sound cloudy. Right? But if you're playing many notes, if you're doing a jazz thing, if you're walking around, if your line suggests that note, then you've got to hit it. Doesn't matter if it makes the chord sound cloudy necessarily. Not yet, like, you know, when you start arranging for orchestras and things like that, maybe you'll come up with some clever tricks around particular ones you want. But for right now, you want your bass lines to be just like a melody. And melodies have those same rules. If I've created a concept here, I have to develop it. If I hear a particular note, and in my head I can hear that note says something to me, it says that it's got to go up a bit, then you've got to follow those impulses. Because that's how you're going to take what you guys do at the moment a lot with bass lines, which is you use a lot of pre-formatted things, or you rely on one riff over and over again for the one chord, and start moving them around. Start giving you more scope. So another great thing, the last thing to think of, is even if we're not moving into extensions yet, push yourself by going, I'm going to use 2 different positions, which is a great way of like really frying your brain. Is okay, I start here, and my E chord has to end here. Then I start B minor here, and then I got to go down to here, right? Those kind of rules. It's a little better if you do these without too much time pressure, like you just kind of give yourself as much time on each chord as possible. B minor. All right, now E7. A. C. Sorry, C is the third of A minor. A minor. Then E. C sharp. Right? Challenge yourself to, say, use 2 positions for every chord you're crossing through. It is probably going to make you stare cross-eyed at the neck for a bit. But it's that kind of thing that's going to really start opening your eyes to the melodic possibilities of bass. Nobody needs to study more about how to use roots and fifths. I'm sure you guys have nailed the crap out of that. Like, roots and fifths are fantastic, and they're ones that you should dwell around. But these extra notes and these other options are where you're going to get really beautiful bass sounds and beautiful bass lines out of, and develop the amount of skill you need to support other music. And by that, I mean, you hear a sound that someone else is making. It's a live version. Someone took it in a different direction on one verse. You hear someone suddenly pull the floor out of the mix. You can respond. The guitarist on this time at live is taking the solo and it's really ripping up, and you're like, well, my job is to help him elevate the energy level because he's doing it really well. So I've got to choose lines that do that for me. Right? And these are the tools. All right, any questions before we wrap it up for this week? So, sorry, just to recap as the last thing, this week's kind of homework, and I know I don't give you guys a lot of homework other than study your chords, but this week's homework is to find some bass lines for this progression. Things that you think sound cool and sound melodic. All right, so we don't want things to be too riffy. We want things to adequately sound like the chords. So, yeah, any questions? Obviously, feel free to hit me up with questions as they occur to you when you start doing the work. Even if you come up with half a bass line and you're like, I don't know where this would go, where would you go? That's a great thing to send me. Just send me a little clip of it, and I'll help you finish the line.
No, thank you. That's great.
Thank you.
All right. Well, as always, guys, you know where to find me. Next week, next lesson, next fortnight, we're going to be doing a lot more of the repeating of this kind of stuff because I feel like we need a fair amount of repetition on it. So we'll probably look at a few different chord progressions. If you guys have a particular chord progression you'd like to look at, like some songs you really like, send me some suggestions. I'm happy to take them. I'll probably, if it's left to me, I think for the next one I will still do a jazz standard, something like My Funny Valentine, with a minor line cliche in it, because they're really fun to work around on the bass, especially using your pentatonic scales, which would be kind of a different avenue too that we didn't talk about this week. So just primarily though, if you guys can all with your spare time, jump in a bit on this concept of line and expressing chords. That'd be awesome. Alrighty, guys. Well, catch you at the next fortnight. Hit me up with any questions you got, or if you want to meet up and have a chat about some of this stuff outside, just let me know.
No worries. Thank you.
No, my pleasure.
Thanks. Yeah.
Catch you next week, guys. Or next fortnight.
Thanks, Alex. Have a good one.
Yeah, you too.